We will wait 2 more minutes to start, and then I will give the floor first for the interpreters. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Vamos a esperar 1 minuto más antes de empezar y le voy a dar también luego la palabra a las intérpretes para que nos digan cómo usar la interpretación. Este webinar tiene interpretación español-inglés. This webinar will have interpretation for Spanish to English and English to Spanish. Thank you. Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everybody to this webinar that we're hosting collectively and jointly with WILPF, Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia, y ECMIA. Before I start, I would like to give the mic to the interpreters so that they let us know how are we going to have access to the interpretation services and help us have this dialogue with the 2 languages. Go ahead.
Emilia, can you explain also in Spanish, because the Spanish channel is not working yet? So for people that it's ready for the Spanish, can you also explain it?
Muchas gracias por estar aquí este día, este webinar que se ha organizado de forma conjunta con Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia, WILPF y ECMIA. Antes de empezar, le voy a dar la palabra a las intérpretes para que nos ayuden a entender cómo vamos a utilizar la interpretación, porque este webinar va a tener interpretación español-inglés e inglés-español. Adelante.
Muy buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Hello, everybody. Este webinario será en inglés y en español y va a haber interpretación simultánea, como ya se mencionó. Entonces, le pedimos el favor de prestar atención a este anuncio importante. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. As was mentioned, let me explain that this meeting will be in both English and Spanish. There will be speaking people presenting. So if you are not fully bilingual, please pay attention to this important announcement about the interpretation. I will do it first in Spanish and then in English. Para las personas no bilingües que desean escuchar y hablar en español, busquen el botón que dice interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla de su ordenador. Si no ve el botón, pulse el menú que dice más, donde hay 3 puntitos, y de ahí va a haber la opción para interpretación. De ahí puede escoger el idioma que desea escuchar y hablar. If you are on a computer, look at the bottom of your screen and look for a button that says interpretation. If you don't see that, click on the More menu and you should see the option for interpretation. Click on that, and from there you should be able to choose the language that you both want to listen and speak in. If you have any problems with interpretation, please put something in the chat, because we don't want you to suffer in silence, and somebody will help you. Si tiene algún problema con la interpretación, anótelo en el chat y alguien le va a ayudar. No queremos que sufra en silencio. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, and back to you, Nela.
Thank you so much for this. So let me introduce myself. I am Emilia Reyes. I am the Program Director of Policies and Budgets for Equality and Sustainable Development in the feminist organization called Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia, based in Mexico. And I will be the moderator for today. Thank you so much for joining. This is a very interesting convening because on the one hand, we have a Financing for Development conference approaching next week in Sevilla. On the other, we had an approved outcome document just this Tuesday in New York. So we do have our resolutions by member states on what we expect to see in an implementation manner in the FFD process. On the other hand, we are also facing a very dire crisis in the world. It is a crisis of multilateralism, but also pretty much it is very connected with a genocide that we are witnessing that is being carried out by Israel, which is an imperial project carried out by developed countries, by the wealthy countries, including the US, the European Union, but also Australia, Japan, and many other countries that are benefiting from the, let us say, the presence of a bastion defending their imperial interests in the North Africa and Middle Eastern region. I think I have a mix of the sound of interpretation. Let me see. Okay, so there we are witnessing this genocide, and we're also now in the recent events with something unfolding, with a threat of a nuclear war because of the expansion of this conflict in the entire Swana region, and the US and all of these imperial powers very much involved with the open attacks into the population of at least 5 countries. So now with the recent events with Iran, we're seeing that this is the culmination of events that we were seeing coming from many years ago, decades ago. And but also terrifyingly enough, in FFD, we saw the EU adding language on conflict in every segment of the FFD chapters across the entire negotiation. And the civil society monitoring the FFD process were so caught up in monitoring very important issues related to economic justice, such as tax justice, trade justice, debt justice, systemic issues, climate justice. There was such a dire gathering of civil society calling for urgent measures. But then these alarms were also on from the beginning of the negotiation, and there was no reaction by civil society. And there is this impression that people working on economic justice say, oh, that's for people who work on conflict, that's for people who work on peace and security, that's for people who work on humanitarian agendas. That has nothing to do with what we do. And on the other hand, the EU was announcing all this year that they were not going to fulfill any of the commitments on tax justice, on debt justice, development cooperation, etc., because they were shifting away from an economy base of the usual unequal exchange, which was bad enough, which was premised on imperial and colonial dynamics. But now that, let us say, normalized dynamic that was based on this unequal exchange, the extraction of value from developing countries to developed countries, now is turning into a blatant economy of war. So we are here to discuss, on the one hand, what does this mean that they were getting ready and announcing that they were going to transit towards an economy of war. And on the other hand, what does that mean for the planet? We saw also that the regular capitalistic system was already being genocidal and ecocidal at its heart by depleting the lives of people in the global south, but also the ecosystems in the global south. And now is shifting away into a new death spree that is again going to be based on the suffering of people in the global south. This webinar is also premised on the assumption that there is a core, that there is an imperial core of powerful countries, and there is a periphery. But also there is a semi-periphery that is also being exploited by this imperial core. So we will also hear from this perspective how the experiences on this semi-periphery has also been shaped by these, to prioritize what we call the imperial modes of living. And so on the other hand, we do have solutions that are feminist solutions for an alternative and economic system. And we've always had resistance. We've always had alternative proposals that are coming from Indigenous peoples and also from feminist voices within the Indigenous peoples that have made sound suggestions of a parallel way of living, of a different way in which we can shape our economic systems. And so this webinar today will focus on those hidden agendas, the underlying agendas. We keep on saying FFD is about economic justice, and then we realize that there is a dystopic reality that we're living all day. We are glued to the news, seeing on the one hand a genocide happening, unfolding in front of our eyes and carried out by all of those governments who claim they are champions of human rights. They are committed to deliver economic justice, that are committed to fulfilling development. And on the other hand, we're also witnessing how they're getting ready for economies of war that is not only about this is a good economy versus a bad economy. Oh, you should shift the money. Don't spend it. Don't spend this money on war or arms. Spend it better to reduce poverty. It's better to be spent on public funding. This is really not about that, because what happens in an economy of war, it is an economy of debt. It is an economy of blood. Whose blood? Whose death? And that's the other phase of the naturalization of the murder, of the criminality that is committed against people in the global south. These racialized communities that are not considered human beings. And there's this hierarchy of life that the imperial modes of living are imposing. So when FFD is being posed to us as an agenda of economic justice, it is a good moment now to think if this economic justice is just technocratic, we're just going to achieve it through reforms in the UN, in an economic practice, or this is about life and what is the type of life that we want to uphold. So for this and many other reasons, we're going to have a wider conversation with very relevant activists. I'm going to introduce first Nela Porovic. She's a feminist from Bosnia and Herzegovina. She works with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom on feminist political economy. And she's looking at how economies for peace should look like, but she's also very well placed to explain us a bit more about this notion of economy of war. Then we will have another speaker, I will introduce her later, about how are the dynamics of imperialism and how this was also strongly debated in the FFD agenda. And finally, we will also have a speaker who's bringing us the alternatives from Indigenous peoples to show that another world is possible. And they have been upholding that for so many years, despite there being a threat. So first, I'm going to give the floor to Nela. We are very happy and pleased to have you. Nela, I'm going to give you the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Emilia, and thank you for that kind introduction. I just want to, on behalf of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, also thank and welcome everyone who has joined this very important conversation. And Emilia, you really did frame it very well. There are many hidden agendas, and there's a lot to talk about and flag for how the conversation might actually be set up to fail. So just very quickly, for those of you who don't know WILPF or our work, just to say that WILPF is a global feminist peace organization. We have members from all over the world, and we go back as far as 1915, when women got together to try to stop the First World War. And I say this because already back then, WILPF actually warned against the nexus between militarism and profit. And unfortunately, to this very date, nothing has changed in our root cause analysis. Sustainable peace, development, and freedom can't really be achieved when inequality is perpetuated by patriarchy, by militarism, by capitalism, by racism, colonialism, and imperialism, as you were mentioning, Emilia. So the workings of these systems are as visible as ever, and we experience them on our lives on a daily basis. As a matter of introduction, as you already mentioned, I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina myself. This is a country that has gone through a vicious war in the early 90s, and it's geopolitically situated as semi-periphery in a global sense, but it's also very much a periphery in the sense of European Union. And this position allows really, but sadly, to reflect on how intertwined the conversation on development and peace really are. And they are really one and the same conversation. So I have to say that it was somewhat with disappointment to see that even though the outcome document does at the end have a paragraph that says that no sustainable development can happen without peace and vice versa, the discussions leading up to this document have failed really to address militarization and rampant military spending as part of one and the same conversation. So I really think when this is not addressed and we make commitments, these commitments become empty words. Because short of committing to disarmament and full demilitarization, I'm not really sure what kind of development and in extension peace we can talk about. So with that in mind, I really want to raise a couple of things in relation to militarism that, despite of the gravity of the situation, remain hidden in this discussion. There is, I think, lots of things to be said, and because I only have 10 minutes, I will stick to very key few of them, but so just so you know, I'm not attempting to holistically cover it. I just want to raise a couple of things for discussion and action. And as you already said, Emilia, I think we cannot have any of these conversations really without reflecting on the very moment we're living in, and the fact that genocide is being committed against the people of Palestine, and it is not only committed by Israel, but it actually implicates many of the countries that will be in Sevilla in a couple of days. And their complicity, of course, goes beyond Gaza and the genocide against the Palestinian people. It goes all the way to Sudan, all the way to Congo, to Yemen, to Syria, to Ukraine, to the unlawful attacks on Iran, and countless other countries that are continuously being destroyed by militarism. They really cannot claim commitment to development while at the same time being committed to destruction. It doesn't really work like that. And on a sort of very emotional level, it feels really offensive to discuss and commitment to development, while at the same time we see what is happening in Gaza. And I wonder also what kind of development people in Gaza can expect, and what kind of solidarity can we expect to be able to deliver post-genocide, right? And countries really need to be held to account and called out for their duplicity and complicity. A second thing that I think is important to discuss, and I trust that it doesn't come as anything new to this group, but I think still needs to be flagged, is the poverty that the outcome document discusses, and says that poverty in all its forms and dimensions is the greatest challenge. But we all here know that it's not a natural state of being for people and countries. It has its roots in capitalist political economy. It has its roots in patriarchal norms, in colonial heritage, and neo-colonial and imperialist policies that lead to systematic exploitation of people and labor, that lead to exploitation of their culture, to expropriation, dispossession, destruction of their land and commons. And it has its roots in wars that are waged against them and all around them, driving them off the lands they live on and forcing them to cross dangerous migration routes. And Bosnia is actually on that route. So we very much witness every day what is happening, forcing them on this route only to be beaten and violated at the militarized border of Western countries. And then if they manage to come through the borders, to further be exploited as cheap labor or worse. I think this really needs to be spelled out. Poverty is not a state of being. It is created by systemic oppression and exploitation and upheld by militarism. We also need clarity in the narrative around environment, as you were already mentioning, and that the catastrophic climate change the outcome document refers to cannot really be detached from the fact that militaries and military activity is the biggest polluters. And as you were saying, we are like this close to nuclear fallout and potentially nuclear war. So militarism, it fuels conflicts, and the use of weapons aggravates environmental harms, which is in direct collision with the narrative on development and the so-called commitment to tackling climate change. We are not only witnessing genocide, but also ecocide, as you say. I think also it's really important to make another connection between militarism, and that is how conflicts, wars, and violence they produce really relies on women's social reproductive labor. We cannot really talk about gender equality as being important for development without understanding the effects of war, military operations, and the effects of military expenditure and the way they affect the ability of women and gender non-conforming and LGBTQ plus people, their ability to lead decent lives. I really think we need some clarity in how we can achieve gender equality in this world that is deeply unequal, riddled with structural racism, and where under the conditions of capitalist political economy, labor is done under deeply exploitative and extractivist conditions. And I think from a feminist perspective, this is not really the world we want to be equal to. So I think also there's no amount of entrepreneurial endeavors and loans, to help women start businesses that can help adjust this. What we need is really transformative approaches, and they start with recognizing that capitalism is harmful and that patriarchy and militarism help sustain it. And finally, there is one other clarity that I really want to bring into the discussion, and there is this narrative. It's about this narrative that there is no money for development, as you were saying, right? So the outcome document says that the financing for development gap has widened significantly over the last 5 years, reaching around $4 trillion annually. So as feminists, we know that, questions that are posed in a wrong way really obscure the reality. So I really want us to invite us all to try to push to rephrase of this question, or rephrasing of this narrative, because I think the real question is not how we replenish the financial gap, but really why this gap was created in the first place, who is paying for that gap, and the real question is where the money is going, what we're spending it on, and who benefits from it. So while, yes, there is this financial gap, I think we agree on that, but it's a deliberate one. It's a result of political choices made by those in power. And as you were saying, Emilia, the political and economic elite is committed to militarism, and it's committed to war economies. And right now, economies are being repurposed for war. And part of militaristic commitment or this militaristic discourse is to claim that investments in weapons are really not about waging wars, but actually about ensuring peace. And this is the argument European Union and its individual member states as well are using to raise more than 800 billion euros to, in their world, defend peace from the perceived threat from Russia. It is the argument Russia is using in relation to its perceived threat from Ukraine and NATO countries. This is what India and Pakistan are using, in relation to each other. And it is, of course, what Israel is claiming while simultaneously waging war against an entire region and committing genocide. And this discourse, or this economy of war, comes with real financial commitments, and it stands in stark contrast to the actual lack of commitment to financing for development. So maybe you're all familiar, but let me just repeat, according to CIPRI's latest report, world military expenditure has reached $2.7 trillion US dollars in 2024, which is the highest global total ever recorded. And this is an increase by 9.4% compared to 2023. And I think we can expect a new increase in 2026. So while the financial gap for development is growing, that certainly is not the case when it comes to investments and commitments to killing machines. So when countries come together in Sevilla and also beyond, to discuss this gap, we need to know that not all, but many countries, especially Western countries, are the same countries who, in their words, in their actions, and yes, in their budgetary spending, are very much committed to exploitation to destruction of people and the planet, to mass killing, to intentional starvation, and to genocide. And this is not a gap. This is more than that. This is a commitment to systems of oppression that brought us to this very situation in the first place. And it's a commitment, and I really think we need to be spelling it out. It's a commitment to militarism, to racism, to neocolonialism, to imperialism, and of course, to capitalism. And this is my final point, as long as this commitment persists, the security they're talking about, the development they're talking about, will only ever be accessible to few countries and few privileged individuals in those countries. There will never be sufficient financing for development for the rest of us. I managed the 10 minutes, I think. Thank you.
Yes, Nela, thank you so much. We want to be very on time because we also want to have enough time to engage with our audience. But that was brilliant, Nela. Thank you so much for also pointing out the hypocrisy and the criminality of these countries that claim to be not only guardians of human rights, but also upholding the notions of development. So what is really their plan? And I think that's a major conversation we need to have. So thank you for that, Nela. Now I'm gonna introduce our next speaker. She is Isabela Boada. She's a Venezuelan feminist and the public policy advocacy officer at Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia. And Isabela, of course, comes from a very key reality in being the subject of the sanctions and unilateral coercive measures by this imperial system. So whenever countries are not disciplined to the logics of the markets, of the capitalistic system, then they face both sanctions that are supposedly legal in the international system or illegal unilateral coercive measures. So Isabela is here to tell us about this topic that was very much discussed in the FFD process and is also a very strong point of tensions in the UN, but somehow it keeps on being delayed, and technical people say, oh, that's not an economic issue, or that's a political issue, or it's always the same country that are delaying and they just don't want to see an outcome. But what is at the heart of this agenda of unilateral coercive measures and sanctions? So for that, we are very grateful to have Isabela here. Isabela, you have the floor. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Emilia, and everybody else who is here. I will try to explain the topics that are being sidelined and to see what options we have to access a dignified life. I'm going to speak from Venezuela about coercive sanctions that we're facing. And even though they're explained as though they're having to do with development, and this has to do with sanctions and the blockade, and then there's other spaces where there are certain distinctions that are being made. They're not that substantial or significant, but they are important to talk about. These are all devices of control that are being exercised over the country, and it's important to understand that this goes against the population of the country, and to destabilize or force a change that is political or in the government, or which might be through a popular implosion, through precarity of the population. And this will hopefully from the outside lead to political change. And this is just as also questionable as the blockade. There's also intimidation that is happening bilaterally through the UN. which has established a mechanism where countries cannot go directly to armed mechanisms, and they need to at first call them out internationally, that they're causing problems for international peace and security, and that there should be prior mechanisms before a war. And first, there will be the application of economic measures beforehand, and this is to stave off war and to increase security. The multilateral coercion and blockade is applied by a state or group of states against a population, it's not targeted. And this is, and although sanctions are supposed to be seeking to maintain peace, this is a decision by one state towards another. And there's commercial, economic measures, and the exit that they're seeking, especially in the global north, that are applying these due to the lack of consensus in multilateral spaces. Then coercive methods are aimed at strategic actors in countries, while the blockade is total. It's an embargo that covers all economic and trade spheres. Currently, the US is imposing coercive measures against about 30 countries, even though this has not been discussed in any multilateral space. So the unvisible reasons that need to be brought to light and questioned have to do with the economic and geopolitical interests of the United States. In the narrative, we see that the imposition of measures is always accompanied by a discourse in favor of human rights and democracy, but it's paradoxical because at the same time that they're demanding that human rights be respected, they are putting people's human rights at risk and making it difficult for people to have a decent life. So in general, we can say that these are control devices that are not just against the state, but also against the population. And therefore, it keeps countries from being able to access the financial system, which is completely controlled by the US. And the international global architecture for finance is managed from the United States. And so this impedes trade between the sanctioned and sanctioning states. It also turns into a mechanism that prohibits or prevents trade between sanctioned countries. And that this can lead to bankruptcy in these sanctioned countries, depending on the level of dependence that the country has on international dynamics. if a country has a lot of international links, as such as Venezuela, which is a oil selling country, but if their buyers are cut off from them, it can be catastrophic. And would lead to them selling their oil to other countries if the US stops buying, and the US is the major buyer. And this would tend to isolate Venezuela, and they would stop earning money, which would make it hard to buy food or even spare parts that are very specialized in a country like Venezuela that depends on oil production. Much of the food and spare parts that they need would be hard to obtain, and this would be a drastic effect on the population. And this has been recognized not just by the Venezuelan government, but also by UN experts. In 3 years, Venezuela saw a 90% drop in their foreign exchange, totally affecting their economy, which is obviously affecting the possibility of the state to provide for the needs of the population through the main economic driver of the country, or oil. It is also important to bring up the history of how this started. In 2015, the United States, under Obama, of course, declared that Venezuela was an extraordinary threat. And this was accompanied by a law passed by the Congress in favor of human rights in Venezuela. And this legal apparatus gave legal cover for sanctions. And Venezuela is among the 5 most sanctioned countries by the United States. There have been more than 1,000 sanctions. Why is Venezuela seen as a threat to the #1 military power in the world? I'm somebody who believes that in Venezuela, there is an anti-imperialist political process underway to try to begin to promote a multipolar world in a context where the United States wanted to be the only one trading with Caribbean and Latin American countries. And Venezuela was one of the countries that spoke out against the free trade agreements between the US and Latin American countries. And so a lot of these policies in Venezuela are seen as attacking the interests of the United States, especially under Hugo Chavez's administration through Alba Petroleos. It became clear through their attempts to sell oil directly how these international relations run by the US were having an effect. And this was very systematic, and it required a lot of discipline on part of the Venezuelan people under Chavez, and not just Chavez. And not just, and which was an entire anti-imperialist project. And there were also a lot of other actions taken at the time against the Venezuelan government, such as coups by groups that were using anti-democratic means to try to take over the government. So here the most important thing is to make visible that the consequences for Venezuela have been catastrophic. There has been a 90% contraction in its economy. Wages are down, and the public's wages have gone down, and this has been captured by the UN relator, and I'm a professor, and I just get like a 25 cents an hour for the work I do. People have tried to have needed to figure out how to get by any way they can, as they have in many other places in Latin America, in order to get basic needs. And that's not even talking about access to development. So the country has to come up with many different strategies every day to try to get access to basic. I'm sorry, you have to start winding up. We're running out of time. But we'll have more time to come back to this. So finally, so coercion does work, because we have had in Venezuela a whole process of hope and of politicization of people in a context where there has been high participation in the political arena. And now there's rejection of politics and those who are in the government. And even though I'm critical of Maduro's government and the Venezuelan government, I still firmly believe that there is no corruption that is equal to the harm that is being done unilaterally against the Venezuelan people. So I can talk about more about this later.
Thank you, Isabella. And we are going to start with a more optimistic side, because we have alternatives to this economic system. We have many proposals that are being implemented in the field, and then there are proposals for transformation that will help all of us. We have Tarsila Rivera, who will present her work. Tarsila is president of Chirapac, coordinator for Red Continental, Mujeres Indígenas de las Américas. She's been an activist defending women's rights, indigenous people's rights, and she has more than 40 years since she was a child in Peru. She has been the voice of many young feminist women in South America, in Latin America. Tarsila. Thank you so much. I'm in a hotel. I'm not going to show my screen because I'm afraid it's going to freeze. First of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity to share the efforts of Indigenous women. And we are trying to understand what's happening in the global scene, and what Nela has shared, and the Venezuela issue that has been mentioned. makes us see or look at how Indigenous women are at risk in these countries and how we are put in a more vulnerable position or situation. And this is how we see that we Indigenous women have made a lot of effort to find tools to navigate this context, because these systems, the government systems and the international systems, they are directed only one way, to their pockets, whether they get bigger or smaller. And in this context, we Indigenous women, we see a big threat. We don't have the basic conditions to meet the 2030 goals, which is the sustainable goals. What do Indigenous women want in terms of sustainable goals? And this is also what we're looking at in these discussions of financing and the economy. Some years ago, we women, Indigenous women, started discussion about what would be economic justice from local to global level. We're not isolated. We are connected. We build common spaces. We strengthen our proposals from a concrete reality that comes from bottom up. After so many years and analyzing this impact of the invasion and colonizations in all these aspects in our towns and communities, we are putting forward a tool or valuing like, what is our capital? What is the capital that we bring as Indigenous women? Are we still taking care of the land that has been appropriated externally? Because they give the economic value of what's under the earth. It has been invaded by external forces because they see value of the land, but in their monetary economy perspective, they see the territory, the land, without taking into account the people, such as extractionary industries, and also the drug traffickers taking this to the pharmaceutical industry. And all this happens without taking into account the word, the voice of, and the contribution of Indigenous women who have been taking care of this biodiversity that has value and impacts health, health and our environment, but it's being seen only from the economic side of perspective. So we see that these speeches talk about justice, redistribution. However, in reality, nothing happens in concrete. So we see a contradiction, for example, between the government decisions in the international level. They commit to meet these plans and agreements, but at the field level, at the national level, it doesn't happen. For example, the environment commitments. So what happens is that they just say that externally, they just see that in the indigenous lands, there are resources that are of economic value for them, but they don't respect indigenous peoples. So we, indigenous women, are reflecting on how we have contributed to all the collective that benefits humanity. We have taken care of forests, the huge biodiversity, medicinal plants, the seeds for food, the waters, a clean environment. So from outside, they don't value these as we do. We see them as elements that have life. So we want to hear and we want to be heard. How we are part of all these feminist women's movements, how we're part of this, how we could add what we are contributing, how through this knowledge, local knowledge, for example, we are facing this environmental impact. Women, Indigenous women, we take care of the seeds. We choose the seeds, we take care of it. We take care of the biodiversity of these medicinal plants. And we use them to eradicate malnutrition, anemia, for example. Why our contributions are not being recognized as benefits to all? We want to contribute to a society that respects all, but also sustain life. So listening to Indigenous women, it's important because we are contributing to the solution. We don't want to be seen as a problem. We want to be recognized as with our contributions and give us this space to have value. And then when we talk about redistribution, when we talk about justice, let's not just think about the money from the government that comes to our sector as a donation or part of a project. And we are just invited to those spaces. There are so many things that we want to share in the development of peace. We cannot have justice, peace, health if the big monsters of the world want to bomb not just people, but nature. They're going to kill nature. So what are we going to breathe? What are we going to eat? We have to have a collective responsibility from the indigenous towns. We women, indigenous women, we're looking at all these. We are looking at the future. We're looking at the lives of the future generations. We're not thinking that our grandchildren will go somewhere else. We're thinking that we need to project our life, the life of the next generations in terms of food and environment and all that. So all this work that we have done to be part of this pseudo-democratic governments have become a threat to our communities now because some communities live with a free determination because these they're just seen as how they could be used for the economy or how they could be used in many ways. So we are working on this process. We are conscious of what's happening in the world, in our states, and these are no favorable conditions. But we are people, towns who have resisted from many, many years, millions of years, and we continue to adapt, innovate to the local, global context. And we want to, or we work on keeping the equilibrium balance and build those relations in balance. Thank you. We always have to say what's needed to inspire, and that's it. Thank you, Tarsila. Tarsila has to go. If anyone want to send some comments or questions to Tarsila, Tarsila can just stay a couple of more minutes in case you have any questions, in case there is any questions.
Tarsila, the chat says that your clarity is admirable. And then Sandra says that Indigenous people and women do not have equal access to productive resources and assets, public services, etc. And much of their labor remains invisible and unpaid, even though their workloads are increasingly heavy due to the migration of men, poverty, exclusion, and especially the effects of climate change. Does anybody else have any comments or questions for Tarsila? From the perspective of the workloads of Indigenous women, unfortunately, we have grown up in a society that gives us collective responsibility in Indigenous societies. If we're adults, the older people are responsible for taking care of the younger kids, not, and then we also have to take care of the elders. And we don't consider this a burden. We consider this a responsibility and reciprocity. It comes, we give and we receive. We also have a responsibility with the bigger family, which is the community. We see the community as an extended family. It is not just parents and children. And there is also responsibility for the elders in the community. And people are also responsible for children who are born to irresponsible couples, and we have the responsibility to contribute to the economy and to work. It's something different. It's different. We don't feel like we're less or incapable. Many Indigenous communities have brilliant women who are farmers, brilliant in choosing seeds, brilliant negotiators in the sense of dialogue and achieving through that things. And then the system comes in from the outside, harmed us. It harmed our self-esteem and cut off all our ability to develop ourselves, and forced us to more accept what came in from outside. So we need to develop our skills so that we can face what's coming at us from the outside, because we're not incapable. But extractive industries come in and they turn girls into objects. These are other conditioning factors that are harmful to us, and we need to respond to them differently than the way we've been dealing with life in the past. And how much does the state really owe us? How much should they be giving to us in redistribution that we're owed? And we don't have access to decent work, to decent education, or to human rights. For example, to not be raped as an Indigenous girl in a public school. But we can't spend our whole lives crying. As I always say, we have to do something. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tarsila. I know you have to leave, but we want to thank you very much for your presentation. And we also want to mention that they have worked hard on economic justice and on the collective rights. And they have worked on economic justice, and this is very interesting. Thank you so much. How many years has this been in your organization? 30? Congratulations. It's been 20 for FIMI, the International Forum of Indigenous Women. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary. And then 30 years in October of the Peruvian organization. And so we're just always learning more. So congratulations. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you and giving you a warm embrace in Seville. Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.
Mi celular, but let me switch back to English. We are gonna come back to the dialogue with Nela and with Isa. I'm gonna change to my cell phone because my battery is dying. But while I do that, I want to ask Nela, what is your view for a new multilateralism? Or is that too much?
No. Well, there's so much. Well, thank you. That's actually a really, it's a really good question. There's much in this conversation, I think, that actually lays a good ground, especially the points Tarsila was making about the indigenous perspective. And I was thinking about how much our multilateralism is so firmly grounded in this, or is vetted in a relationship between a capitalist nation state and its citizens, and understands multilateralism only through this sort of perspective, and how much we really need to start thinking about how a different multilateralism would look like, right? And I think it's in this, I think maybe I want to answer this question by inviting us all in this room today to think about how we could reimagine exactly this multilateralism, because one of the biggest achievements, I think, of neoliberalism and this hegemony of capitalist nation states has been to really instill in our minds that the only possible space for thinking and imagining how we as people, as the people, right, want to be with each other in the way that Tarsila was talking about, and how we want to be with our natural environment. And it has been instilled in our minds that it's only possible within these limits of existing frameworks like institutions, policies, and multilateral cooperations. And I think when we think about different social struggles, and of course in this sort of previous periods, we have been creating ourselves space and been able to think around the edges of this system. And we have even have many gains. We have been able to improve the system, but we've never really changed the structures. If we look at our social struggles, even those that have succeeded, what we have seen is that patriarchy and militarism and capitalism and racism have proven really, really adaptable and very capable to co-opt our political demands and even our language. When we demand gender equality, the gender equality of feminist language comes back to us in form of gender mainstreaming and entrepreneurship among women, right? When we demand emancipation of women. So they manage to reshape themselves somehow, these structures, and they always manage to go side by side. So it's kind of in this question, how do I imagine a new multilateralism? I think part of the answer to that question is also understanding how the multilateralism we have today is a product of colonial times and is infused with power dynamics. And we just heard word from Isabella and from Tarsila how that power dynamics looks like and how it always actually plays in favor to the capitalist core countries. And unfortunately, it lends itself too easily to neo-colonial and imperialist projects today. And that happens both through their actions, but also through their inactions, as we're seeing today. And I think this holds true both for the United Nations, and it's probably most visible and most bluntly visible through the Security Council with its permanent membership and veto rights, but it's also true, of course, for the financial architecture across development and peace and environment and human rights and humanitarian spaces and even wider. So I do think we need to imagine definitely a new multilateral space. I am a bit, though, conflicted, I have to admit, around this very moment, because I feel there is a certain responsibility towards anyone on this planet that is dying at this very moment, that is starving, that is being subjected to violence of any kind, that is living through internal oppression or external aggression, or probably both. I feel there is a responsibility to continue using whatever is left of the multilateral system to hold the governments and private entities accountable to their internal legal obligations, but at the same time recognizing how deeply embedded it is in colonial heritage. I think we do need to create spaces for ourselves to put together a strategy whose ultimate goal is actually exactly to reimagine a different multilateral space at the same time as we continue pressing and holding countries and private entities to account. But I think that can only be like a mitigation strategy, right? That can never be an ultimate goal. I think from my perspective and from where WILPF is coming from, a new multilateralism needs to build on cooperation. It needs to build on interdependence, on the principles of care that Tarsila was among others mentioning. It cannot build on profit. It cannot build on exploitation and individualism. And it has to be committed to a fully demilitarized societies, because that's the only way we can provide for security for all life forms and can provide for security in all our relationships and environments, both natural and social. And I think we really need to sort of work both ways, imagine, but also be responsible towards people dying today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nela. We have a comment that says that there's a question whether this is north-south or whether it's about the poor people being exploited by the wealthiest. I wanted to mention just one thing, that that the developed countries have an imperial way of living. If they're responsible for 92% of the excess carbon emissions, this is why we talk about atmospheric colonization. But also they're responsible for the use of the 70% of all of the natural resources in the world. 50% of them come from the global south to the use of the global north to maintain the imperial way of living. If all of the people would live in the way that people in the global north live, we would need 9 planets by 2050 years. So this is really there, and FFD is a real platform that shows all of the difference between global north and south through. This is why it is so important that was the space in which we wanted to achieve the democratization of an international financial architecture, because all of the imbalance that there is, not only on trade justice and trying to strengthen the tax convention that is out there, but also trying to achieve a debt convention in which the pressing debt that developing countries are not allowing them not even to spend on health and education. And even the issue that Isabella was mentioning, we know that currently, since the inception of the UN to this moment, no developed countries has ever received a sanction has never been subject to a unilateral coercive measure. So this system is definitely made for this colonial project, this imperial project, to continue to maintain an imperial way of living of the global north and to discard the lives of the global south, and of course, generating sacrifice zones across the global north, in which all of these spaces, such as indigenous peoples' territories that are now at the expense of settler occupation, but also racialized communities that are living in this, suffering the direct impact of these mega projects. It is true that there are these sacrifice zones within the territorial space of global north countries. But above all, this is a global north project. This is an imperial project. And this is why we're also having this dialogue in the context of FFD and not in an isolated manner, because that was a space in which all of these global dynamics could be addressed. So I want to also go back to Isabella, because, of course, this is why we are talking about imperialism. Some people say, oh, imperialism is an old word. That's very ideologized. Why are you going back to the 80s? But Isabella, you were telling us about these ways of trying to dismantle regimes in the global south because they are a threat to the imperial core. So what can you say also about multilateralism that is transiting out of an imperial system? Isabela, can you hear us?
Sí. Emilia, no sé si lo puedes repetir en español la pregunta.
Sí, ¿cómo sugieres que podríamos transitar hacia un...
How do you suggest we could transition to a multilateral system not based on an imperialistic system? I think the question is complex, as you and Ella mentioned. How the political system is designed and the global decision making is designed to perpetuate this system, this colonialist system that subordinates the global south to the needs and interests of the global north. So the transformation should be structural. We need to build community around a new bed that is not expansionist bed that attacks our planet and is killing life in many ways. As we said, since the UN meeting, we adopted these measures not to get to war, but these measures now kill populations in an indirect way when states can't or communities can't provide health services or food. So it is a way to exterminate populations that are not quote unquote disciplined or get into this dynamics of suppression in the case of the imperialism of the US. And how can we transform the UN? How can we transform it to a more democratic space? We can start questioning these mechanisms, this type of mechanism, like the Security Commission of the UN, and look at the sanctions against a country, a population, but that involves a lot of complexities because the core problem is the focus. We're going to create a a different system with a different economic system, but which one is that? What are we promoting? We need to transform everything. We have to have an economy oriented to the to sustaining life that can guarantee everyone in the world a dignified life, way of life. So I would say we could build community towards those objectives, so as a collective, to those common collective objectives. We do need to redefine which ones are those. What is going to be our agenda? Are we continue to act under this dominant logic, which is kept when the countries accept the rules, decisions of the IMF to apply these economic adjustment structural measures? So we continue this. So we also say that the debt kill. So it also has to be a transformation of the multilateralism, but also the agenda behind it to recognize that women sustain the capitalist system through domestic work and unpaid labor. As Tarsila said, we also need to talk about the protection of our ecosystems, and no one is looking at this in the capitalism system, and how capitalism appropriates all these natural resources, how they steal these from humanity. So we need to have these transformation at different levels, and it has to be deep. This is complicated because we see a more warmonger imperialism that is in control and is more evident. It has always been a policy kept maintained by the US in the last decades, but now we see more prominently this in the immigration policies and starting wars, triggering wars, and support of the genocide against Palestine. So the environment is complex, and it's going to trigger more debates, more advocacy in many other spaces to talk about these issues and make these hidden agendas more visible and to center instead of being distracted. There are many elements in the discussions
Gracias,
that
Isabella. Thank
are
you so much. And I also wanted to make the connection
distracting
between
from the
Nela's
center
point and
discussion.
Isabella with a very weird situation that is happening now, which is now with the ICJ stating that Netanyahu and the two ministers of security in Israel are war criminals. The US sanctioned the ICJ. And so they froze the accounts of the judges in the ICJ, but also they froze the bank accounts of their families. But what happened is that due to these unilateral measures, they also are saying that any company that delivers services to the ICJ will be suffering the same impacts. And so Microsoft stopped its services of internet, of providing the server, etc. So from one day to the other, a UN entity that is in charge of upholding the legal framework in the multilateral space, all of a sudden, the content of their servers, their computers, their servicing, even the emails stopped functioning. The institution itself stopped functioning from one day to the other because of the power of the US and the interests that are at stake in this war, the genocide that is being committed in Palestine, and the importance of the imperial project globally, especially Israel in the Swana region. So the entire multilateral system depends on all of those large transnational corporations. And so it is really important to know that we are all in the hands of these imperial powers at any moment, in any given moment. Even the multilateral system, as is happening now with the UN at this moment, And so the UN reform that is now being discussed is also discussing leaving out the US because of the major threat. But we are so embedded so that technology justice, digital justice, those are also agendas discussed in FFD. And we haven't realized how important it was to get out strong outcomes, to democratize the international financial architectures, to have a convention on technology justice, on digital justice within the UN system, and regulate all of these multinational corporations that are putting at stake life in the planet as we know it, not only the ecosystems, but also the life of people, and even the entire multilateral system is at their grip. So I think this is really dire, and we are talking about all of the interconnection of all of these agendas that are in the FFD chapters, and sadly, the governments, especially the EU, was negotiating in bad faith. In the case of the chapter of debt, the developing countries, the G77, wanted to have a convention on debt, and the EU watered down the paragraphs and watered down and removed everything that was meaningful. And then in the final moments, when in the approval of the document on Tuesday, they also said we disassociate ourselves with this paragraph. So not only they dismantled everything, they stepped out. And so those who are committed to the FFD process, those who will uphold the entire document, will have to live with a watered down language that the EU says, I don't even recognize it. So that is bad faith. That is literally the way in which these powerful countries behave globally without any accountability to their citizens, knowing that they have in their hands the lives of people in the global south. And this is what Isabella was saying, debt kills. And Nela has been also explaining how many lives are at stake. I also wanted to read something that the Transnational Institute of Tipping Point North-South sent me, because they were sadly not here, but they said that they will be releasing a paper tomorrow about the NATO spending. And so what they're saying is that NATO's new 3.5 GDP spending goal will lead to a total military expenditure of US 13.4 trillion by 2030 in the next 5 years. This means a 2.6 trillion increase above current expenditure. This could cover nearly 3 years worth of climate finance needs of developing countries at 1 trillion a year, or pay outright for the world's global electricity grid to be made net zero compatible by 2030. NATO's new 3.5 spending goal would also lead to 2.330 to metric tons of CO2 of total carbon emissions by 2030, almost the same amount as the combined annual GHG emissions of Brazil and Japan. And NATO member states have also increased military investment by an average of 14.8%, while reducing aid budgets by 7.3% between 2023 and 2024. So really, we are talking not only about individual lives, individual ecosystems, we are talking about the life of the planet, the lives of entire regions at the hand of these powerful people. So this is why we're talking about the hidden or the underlying agendas in FFD that were totally dismissed by economic justice activists, but even in the technocratic world of FFD, but this was what was at stake. And we still have the opportunities to continue to engage in FFD to bring these realities out there. I'm gonna also open the floor. I know we are running out of time, but definitely would like to hear from our audience who wants to engage with their reflections. So some questions before we close. Anybody?
You hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
My name is Tashin Shabani from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I'm the Secretary of Salvia Solidarity Group, the rural area community who look after themselves due to ongoing persecution of with communities in Congo. So our preoccupation is lying on.
Sorry, can you speak closer to your mic because we cannot hear you?
Can you hear me now?
I think so. Can you speak louder?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
No, thank you very much. So my name is Tashim Shabani. I'm from Democratic Republic of Congo, and then I'm the secretary executive of Salvia Unity Group in Congo. It's a rural area communities who look after themselves. Whenever due to ongoing security situation, we're trying to see if there's any organization who will to support us in a way to have more information regarding how we can get out of this situation. So we trying to see how they can orient us to have a safety way to move out from Congo to have a safety. So that's why we're trying to get the situation if we can get any organization who may support us in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for expressing these realities on the ground. This is precisely what we're saying, to connect the dots between what is happening at the territory level and at the macro level. Anybody else? Yes, Giovanna, and I see Vero.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. I've got 3 questions. I posted them in the chat. So the first one is, how can demilitarization of non-traditional conflicts be addressed? I ask this because Mexico's internal war is not regarded as a traditional conflict. It is not even called a conflict nor a war. But militarization has increased and continues to increase with each presidential term, with little to no effect rather than social fragmentation and ethnic profiling. So, and also local intervention from the US, especially regarding intelligence and strategic operations, is applauded to a certain point. So, how can we address demilitarization in conflicts that cannot conceive any other alternatives, right? And then the second question is, so between us, attendants of this forum or forums that we continuously attend, we speak the same language. But when we attend dialogues with stakeholders or people then in positions of power, we rarely find any middle ground. So how can we approach these dialogues that, although frustrating, are necessary in the short term? And oftentimes the answer is to not appeal to these spaces and rather create our own, but how can we bridge this gap? Like, should we aim to bridge it, or is it untenable? And the final question in regards to the political economy and militarization in the conflict, do you have any suggestions for literature on the political economy of sexual trafficking? And thank you so much. This has been very enlightening.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. Vero? Are you still there?
Hello, hello. I'm sending greetings from Mexico. I have a short comment. I was in the Claxo conference in Colombia, and the topic of how several countries in the global south see Mexico as an ideal to follow in terms of democratic structures. And I found this very interesting. However, I belong to a movement that has to do with canceling the debt in global south countries. And there was a video with our president, Claudia Sheinbaum, talking. And she went to the G7 meeting to talk about policies to support US policies. And that leaves us to continue fighting against extractive policies that are harmful to our territories and lives. Because in the draft from the UN about debt cancellation, it needs to be called the trap of debt, because that's what it is. It's a trap, because it ends up being an invasion by the North of the South, and affects the whole system of resources in our lives. And we need to deal with these issues with this trap of debt, of invasion of territory, of debt peonage, really. And it's important for the movement to become familiar with this, especially on the left. We have made a lot of progress, but there's a long way to go still. We do have democratic policies, but behind them, there are agreements that are harmful to the population. Thank you.
We are running out of time. What we can say is that on behalf of WILPF, Equidad, and ECMIA, we wanted to make a series of webinars to continue discussing these issues, because all of you have brought so many issues that are new, like, for instance, the notion of multilateralism. I think Tete also in the chat brought up this issue about what are the alternatives for this, and then, but also the current global system implies that developing countries need to engage with these imperial powers, such as precisely what you were saying, the engagement with the G7, the G20, but also in the chat, there has been a very lively conversation about alternatives, what can we do, but also how can we engage further in this conversation, how can we organize, and also the need to get reports, material, more information, this approach of political economy that Nela was bringing, making these connections with the economies of war, but also both of them spoke of economies of peace, both Nela and Tarsila and Isabella's lessons on how to build a multilateral world without imperialism, and learning more about the situation on the ground of these groups of population, and the lessons we can learn also for the linking process within different realities, and the strength that we can learn also from indigenous peoples groups, but also racialized communities that are in resistance, and they're also holding many of the solutions that we are seeking for. I will just let me tell you what we're going to do. On behalf of Equidad, WILPF, and ECMI, I think we can commit to continue these conversations, continue these spaces of webinars and engagement in the future after Sevilla, so that we can engage in a more systematic manner on these issues, to provide also a larger space for all of you to engage, and all of us to organize collectively. I think we can make that commitment, because this space is very much needed from our end, but we see that it is very important to continue to meet. But I'm going to give the floor to Nela and Isabella for 2 minutes each to close, and to help us afterwards. We will meet and reach out to you all, for those of you who joined us, to share materials and to provide with next steps. So Nela, for you.
Thank you so much. I'll be very brief because you've said it all. I think this is first, I want to apologize to Giovanna for never coming to your 3 questions, but maybe I can send at least my perspective via email to you. I've noted them, so I will try at least to do that, since we are running out of time. But thank you all. And I think these conversations really shows the importance of it. And I think we're all in agreement here that this is not about Sevilla. This is much more beyond Sevilla. There's much more to be said. And as chat there were people in the chat saying we are running out of time. And I think we're all committed to try to make to try to create political actions that actually matter, and to reimagine a world where we can live a life that is in dignity and not being commodified by the market. Also on the WILPF side, we hope to continue collaborating with Equidad. We're looking forward of also opening spaces to have these conversations and just to build a whole new world together. So maybe that's what we need. And thank you all for joining and staying with us for this an hour and a half, slightly more. And thank you, Emilia and Isabella, for your generous contributions.
Thank you so much, Isabella.
Muchísimas gracias por este espacio.
Thank you for this space and the reflections. Vero, I was struck but that Mexico is being seen as a model in certain spaces, but it's not necessarily a transforming, but there's still a lot of problems in other countries with Bukele and El Salvador and Trump in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, the Mexican government is laying out a completely different path in the global economic and political system. There are few spaces available to us at present, but exactly from there we need to start working and branch out. Thank you to all of you for being here.
On behalf of Equidad, WILPF, and ECMIA, we wish you a nice day. We will continue discussing the FFD outcomes and the current situation we're living in, the threat of life of people on the planet, because we're seeing it unfold in front of our eyes. But also we want to remain hopeful because we do have solutions, and this is the time to continue organizing. So thank you so much for everybody. And thank you so much for the interpreters. Gracias a las intérpretes y al equipo detrás técnico que nos ayuda a hacer posible este webinar.
Thank you to the interpreters.
Thank you so much.
Help to make
Goodbye.
this possible. Thank you so much. Adios.